episode 12 of Is This a Dream? I'll wait for everyone to jump on and let me know through the chat if the audio and video are coming through okay. See, from Julie, the answer is yes. Dan, all right. Everything looks good from my side, but I just want to make sure. Frozen. Okay, great. Maria, hello from Denmark. Healthy Minds, hello. Wonderful. Okay, Howard says can't hear. Fahad, all good now. Great. I am back. All right. Thank you, Clara. Jen from Florida. All right. So we're on episode 12 of Is This a Dream? And let's start with a few moments in silence together. All right. So let's jump in. I think we might have a shorter session today because of a time constraint. We're going to at least get through these questions, and then we'll tie back into the book in episode 13. All right. So the book is this one. Is This a Dream? The foreword by Deepak Chopra. It is available on Amazon. Please do leave a review if you're able to read it. So the first question was, is the external and internal world one body of Brahman? And Brahman, of course, is the underlying reality. In the philosophy of Vedanta, the name given to what we call reality, or the substratum of this universe, is Brahman. All right, so the question is the external and internal world one body of Brahman? And this is certainly one way that we can experience it, especially as the second mind. What this describes, this question, is the second mind experience, where the sense of identity is of that deeper reality, right? That which appears and self-modifies as body, brain, thoughts, objects, spaces, time, all of these. So that which modifies as these events is called Brahman, or that which apparently modifies as these events. So specifically here, the question is referring to internal and external experience, right? Is the external and internal world one body? So usually when we speak of the body, we're speaking of the physicalized structure that is defined by the boundary of skin, right? But we also know that there are different ways of seeing the human being. If you look at different cultures, in the yogic system, for example, the anatomy of a human being is different. It's not defined primarily by skin and organs and physical organs. If you look at the Chinese system of the body, it involves meridians, right? So different cultures have different perspectives on this. So when we talk about the external and internal world being one body of Brahman, the body of the human being that we see, that we recognize, depends on the culture. And this has implications on medicine. Actually, one of the questions is about medicine coming up. So this will be a background for that as well. Right? Depending on the culture, the vision and view of the body is different because the philosophical assumptions are different, the mind is attuned differently, and therefore perception, what we recognize, is different. So when we speak of the body of Brahman, what we're speaking about is all of the forms and functions that are recognized, which is of course different from the body of the human being as we typically define it. If the body is something that is encapsulated by skin, then there is an internality and an externality to that. Internal to the skin is the heart, the lungs, the brain, the kidneys, liver, spleen, all of the organs are internal to the skin. And external to the skin is, for example, other bodies: bed, chair, tree, stars, sky, right? So then the boundary, or let me show it this way, the boundary between inside and outside is that skin. And therefore, there's an internal system and an external system. But when that boundary is seen through, which is what we're speaking about as a second mind identity, that identity which recognizes what we call the physicalized structure and the physicalized organs, and is not restricted to only this experience of identity, right? In seeing through this boundary, that more inclusive identity, this is what we might call Brahman. And because that boundary is seen through, then the very notion of internality and externality vanishes. Not absolutely vanishes, right? Not that it's not useful, not that it's not functional, not that it doesn't exist at all, but we see that it is a relative boundary depending on the lens that we choose, depending on the identities and the perceptions that we reify as our experience of ourselves and this world. Right? So internality and externality is always relative to the boundary, which in turn is dependent on the identity. So when that boundary is seen through, which is why we say Brahman, the universe is Brahman, right? There is a one of the Mahavakyas, one of the great sayings in Vedanta is Tattvamasi, that thou art, right? Where that refers to Brahman and thou refers to the individual identity. So the individual identity and the deeper reality are one and the same. is the essence of this statement, Tattvamasi. And as that vision, yes, even all that is internal and that is external relative to the individual is, through the eyes of what we call Brahman, one body, one seamless experience. Just as waves rise and subside in the one seamless ocean. This is also called oneness. So just as we might say the waves of different sizes, different speeds are the body of the ocean, right? Similarly, the internal experiences and external experiences, which include objects, which include everything, right? Once we say internal and external, the entire universe is included. It's entirely dependent on that fulcrum of identity, internal and external. But the entire universe is included in those two categories. So both of these categories are the body of Brahman, in which that identity, the first mind identity, is seen through. It doesn't have to be discarded, it's seen through. Gaudi says, Tattvamasi, yes. Megan says, all in one, one is all. Yes, this is the second mind perspective. All is one is all. Multiplicity and unity, right? Diversity and commonality. This is the dance of the second mind. I don't know Spanish, but I see Marisa wrote, the perspective of the second mind. Yes. So the next question, do I need to perceive everything as the expression of Brahman? Do I need to perceive everything as the expression of Brahman? Now, I would say there's no need to perceive everything in any particular way, right? It's not about a particular need. It is about what is the range of experience of being human, right? So this is one experience where the sense of identity is different. And again, we're talking about identity a lot, and some people will say that this is very metaphysical or it's very abstract. One of the things I'm trying to point out is this is something each one of us experiences all the time. There's nothing abstract about this, right? When we daydream, doesn't our identity shift into that character, right? The character within the daydream, right? The identity simultaneously exists in this character, which is daydreaming, right? There's a splitting of identity or a lending of identity in which there's some identity retained as this character and there's some that is deposited in this character within the daydream, right? It is metaphysical in some sense when we apply it to the world. But what I'd like to demonstrate is that metaphysics sounds very complicated and philosophical, but it's not. It's something we're all experiencing all the time. It's just that we haven't been given the links to recognize what is happening. We haven't been given the stories. When we dream, it's the same thing. Identity shifts. The entire mind becomes an entire world in the dream and walls itself off as a character in the dream who apparently has friends and enemies within that dream, right? We can talk about it as metaphysics, or we can talk about it as something we're all experiencing. So this is key. Do I need to perceive everything as the expression of Brahman? It's simply a way of recognizing more comprehensively the nature of what's going on. All right. So simply, I would say no, nobody has to recognize anything in particular. This is simply an option, a way of seeing things, right? A range of experiences in which there are more resources. There are more practical resources for everyone, each of us, to live our lives. Right? This is what all the wisdom traditions are saying. It's not that we have to do something or we need to do something. However, some of the deeper experiences, the more fulfilling experiences, are aspects of this broader domain. Right? So it doesn't have to be a thought, except when we're reflecting. When we're reflecting, we can say, okay, I can sense something subtler, and I can feel this expansiveness and this subtlety. And it doesn't seem to be something that is recognized or that is restricted, rather, to a particular body. So these kind of reflections can happen, thoughts, right? Ultimately, we don't have to name it, this is Brahman and this is everything, all the different things of the world. And that is through the process of thinking about it, reflecting, right? And then let the labels go. Once we're clear on another way of recognizing, we can let the labels go and see what the experience has to offer. It should be practical, right? It should offer more resources for living. It's not something we're following because some book said it. It's not something we're practicing or experimenting with because some book said it, but rather the proof is in whether it is useful, right? Whether there's fulfillment, whether they're the kinds of experiences we find fulfilling in life. All right. Next question. So Gaudi asks, how can we help people internalize this thought so that we can melt away the differences? Steady reflection and meditation. Right? Initially, we talked about in a previous talk, initially it might be that one has to do a lot of work with the body, right? To get to a point where the mind has some steadiness. Or if there's a lot of trauma that we're dealing with, engaging and dealing with the trauma, right? And then taking up reflection, regularity, and ultimately meditation. It is a steady process of going through these cycles, cyclically, right? Engaging all of these cyclically. It is not about taking a thought and sticking only with that thought over and over and over, right? When we talk about internalizing a thought, we don't want to concretize the thought too much because that itself becomes another ingredient now that has to be released, right? The thought leads to the meditativeness and the recognition. So when we say, for example, consciousness is and modifies as this world, right? Then what is consciousness referring to? Is it this thing that is in the head? Is it a broader field, a broader subtlety of livingness, of aliveness, of awareness? Okay, and then we can get the sense of the boundaries starting to diminish and recognizing another way of seeing things. So at this point, the thoughts can be let go, right? I'm kind of verbalizing a reflection. At this point, the thoughts can be let go and then simply notice thoughtless awareness. And if the thoughts are coming up, make the thoughts part of that mindfulness practice. Okay, the thoughts are arising and subsiding. Maybe there are a lot of thoughts. Okay, many are arising and subsiding. So this kind of non-judgmental vision and recognizing what's happening. That is not dependent on the thought. The thought can take us there to what the practice is, and then we become non-dependent on that thought itself. It doesn't matter if spiritual thought, non-spiritual thought, scientific thought, it's all thoughts at that point, right? So it's not about hardening or concretizing or holding on to a thought. It's about using the thought to arrive at the threshold of undifferentiated awareness and then releasing the dependency on that thought as well. Yes, being non-judgmental is the key. So when reflecting, how do you not keep revisiting trauma? Hmm. So this is an important question, especially in what we're calling spirituality, in the field of what we call spirituality these days, that trauma, or more broadly, challenging situations, are not something that can be leapfrogged through spiritual practice, right? In one way or the other, if a person is introspecting, right, if we're looking into our deeper awareness, then whatever it is that a person may have avoided earlier will start to come up, right? If it's a diligent, open, full looking at oneself, then all the things that may have been avoided will start to come up, right? So when we say, how do you not keep revisiting trauma? The very process of introspecting and moving to the deeper layers of the mind will, in fact, bring up trauma, right? And that's why it's important to use a variety of practices. For some people, primarily meditation may work, right? This is why there's in the Vedantic tradition, there's karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga. These are different approaches to increasing one's awareness through action, through faith or devotion, through reflection, right? Through directly working with the energy of the body. There are many ways of approaching this. So it is not about not revisiting trauma. Trauma has to be brought up and healed and released. And whatever had to be integrated has to be integrated. That is part of the process, right? Otherwise, there's a back and forth that happens. That there is a spiritual life and then there is another life, a regular life. Right? But ultimately, these have to be integrated. So this can be through journaling, talking to a friend, talking to a therapist, doing some kind of facilitated conversation, right? All of these ways are important in addressing any trauma and any challenge, right? We're integrating the internal and the external. And so there is work, there is a process that one goes through. All right, there's nothing that's left out. There's nothing that's leapfrogged in the process. Things may happen very quickly. Sometimes things can get integrated quickly. There can be periods of acceleration, but that process continues. All right. Bob Lyons says, what is trauma? How is it a discrete thing? You have to speak. There are many people who are experts on trauma. It's defined in many ways. Some people say it's when there is some kind of event or stimulus that lodges in the body or lodges in the mind that's not processed, that we're not engaging with, and therefore it's kind of locked away and influencing us, right? Regardless of the fact that we're not seeing it. That might be a trauma. A broader way to see it is simply moving with or engaging with or dealing with whatever it is that is coming up. So it doesn't have to be an acute trauma. It can simply be whatever is happening in our lives, right? There's so many challenging things happening in the world, in healthcare, in politics, in economics, in personal life. So being available to engage these is important. I found that in my own practice, is that engaging with these is important. It's not that there is some separate spiritual life or some separate process, but rather the deeper vision and the ranges of experience of being human themselves have resources, have a broader set of resources that enable us to function in our individual spheres, right? That support us in functioning through our individual spheres. All right. So how does this apply to the medical field? I think we addressed this once before. There are two ways. One is the way in which we already talked about, which is that when we're talking about the three minds, when we're speaking about broader ranges of identity, it's a matter of healing trauma. It's a matter of bringing all resources to the table or more resources to the table. It's the ability to see things in different ways, different perspectives, right? So these are the very practical aspects that are not unique to medicine, right? This is in every field. It helps you in every sphere of life. Now, specific to medicine, it is in the field of anatomy and philosophy and the latest science, quantum science, right? So specific to anatomy, right? In fact, I'm doing a series on this, on anatomy. When we look at anatomy, the way anatomy is defined in the medical field is primarily the anatomy of the body. So the heart, lungs, these kinds of physicalized structures. That's one way to see anatomy. Another way to see it, we talked about in the last episode, actually. Please go back and check that one. We were speaking about perception in episode 11. And what we said is the organs of perception, such as the eye, the ear, the nose, themselves, from the first mind perspective, are distinct organs. First mind anatomy, they're distinct organs. From a second mind perspective, even these physicalized structures are a kind of physiology of the second mind, meaning they are partial representations of their function. So seeing looks like the process of seeing as the second mind sees. One of the processes of its seeing is what looks like the optic nerve, the eye, the retina, the lens, right? One of the processes of hearing is the ear. It's not limited to the ear, and it hears through the ear. It's not limited to the eyes in vision, and it sees through the eyes. That's why we can hear, if we want to hear the voice of someone, we can almost hear it, right? Without, even if there's not somebody here. Because that function is not limited to these first mind organs, but rather what we call the organs themselves are representations of that function. So anatomy in the first mind looks at distinct physicalized structures. And from a deeper perspective, we see that even these physicalized structures are a form of second mind physiology, right? And that's why in yoga, the anatomy looks different. You have the chakras and the nadis, right? If you look at the meridians in Chinese medicine, there's so many cultures that see themselves, see what they are, see the anatomy as different, right? Because perception is not restricted to the physicalized structures. It is not only eye, ear, nose, and so on that perceive. It is the mind which perceives, often through these five sense organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, right? So the application in medicine, I'm going to put a website here called secondmindmedicine.com. If you're interested in applications in medicine, you can check this out, secondmindmedicine.com. So the application in medicine is that we see the human being differently through the second mind lens. And there are more possibilities and avenues to healing. And the very definition of healing changes, because it's not only about restoring a particular order to the physical structure, right? It's looking at the deeper currents of the second mind. So another way to say this is the model in medicine today, especially in allopathic medicine. What we say is the model we follow is the biopsychosocial model. The biopsychosocial model. Now, what does that mean? It means that when we look at a process, a disease process, we're looking at through the lens of biology, psychology, and sociology, or at least through body, which is biology, through mind, and through society, right? We're recognizing that there is a host of factors. There are many categories of influence that determine what disease is, that influence disease. Now, the issue with this today in allopathic medicine, the limitation is that our primary expertise is in biology, right? We know very little about the mind. Even though we have fields like psychology, psychiatry, much of the knowledge, the world's knowledge about the mind, doesn't show up in psychology and psychiatry in most training programs, right? So there's little knowledge overall about the mind. And then society, when we say biopsychosocial in terms of society, we have some understanding, but again, this is largely first mind understandings of society, mind, and body. So the biopsychosocial model, while it strives to look at a human being from a holistic perspective, not only from biology, but also from mind and society, the mental configuration itself from which this is done is a first mind configuration. You see? That first mind materialist configuration is what is taught in our society informally. And so even when we try to look at different aspects, we're looking through very rigid lenses. All right? Check out more. You can check out more on Second Mind Medicine. Hita says biology equals body psychology equals mind, and social society equals body, right? So it's how do we broadly define the body? What are the many ways we can define the body? Which is what the first question was. Is the external and internal world one body of Brahman? Right? And if that is the case, then what is the meaning of healing? What is the meaning of illness and wellness? Right? What is the meaning of these different systems of anatomy? All of this has to be incorporated. Satyankara says Corpus Callosum, the gate. Yeah, so the Corpus Callosum connects the right and the left brains, right? Which are, in the second mind perspective, they are partial representations of the mind, right? So the Corpus Callosum, which connects the right and the left mind, which connects two aspects of mind, we can say the creative mind, the spatial mind, with the logical mind, the linear mind, if we connect these two through a physical structure, what is that? As a second mind perspective, it is showing the integration of, for example, art and mathematics, right? Space and objects, right? Creativity, uncertainty, and certainty, definiteness, infinity and finiteness. You see? Oneness and diversity, oneness and multiplicity. So this corpus callosum is a partial representation of this integration, right? Of these different perspectives. So check it out, Second Mind Medicine. Music and surgery, many questions coming in. Please do input your questions and we will address some of these next time, all right? There is an article on secondmindmedicine.com on the biopsychosocial model and why it is insufficient, why it's not going far enough, why it hasn't solved many of the problems in medicine. So if you're interested in healthcare, check that out. Leave your comments and questions, and we will address it next time. Is the ego the false self? So this is often said in spirituality that the ego is the false self and that the real self is Brahman, or is the second mind, or the third mind. I think a better way to see it is that there are different configurations of identity, right? Is it false? I don't know. I wouldn't say the ego is a false self, except in particular contexts we can certainly say that. The ego as an expression of individuality is necessary to function in the world. It doesn't mean that it can't evolve. Yes, it can evolve, it can change, the boundary can loosen, the boundary can thin, the boundary can be translucent. It is still a version of self, it's a kind of self, right? So having the whole toolbox. When we say the self in Vedanta, the self refers to Brahman, the infinite self, the boundless, right? And that superimposing a boundary on itself is what is experienced as individuality. So we don't necessarily need words like real and unreal and self and not self and false and true. This is the range, the smorgasbord of dance, let's say. The smorgasbord of expression, smorgasbord of what is, of existence. And one thing only appears false or becomes false when it becomes such a restrictive perspective that that's the only thing that is seen. It is in that context that we say that this is false, right? That the ego is false. The ego is an experience like anything else, right? Kim Lee says the imbalanced ego is a false self. So that's one way to look at it, right? If it's just one view and it's being restricted to just that view, then we can say that it is false in the sense that there's much more to see and it's being taken out of context. So that out of contextness is the falsity. Right? And when the full context is recognized as that boundary, as that identity becomes subtler, then that notion of falseness falls away. All right. Let's see where we are. Okay, we'll do one more question. So here's a comment that somebody put. There's a COVID question here. Let me answer this instead then. If this is a dream, why do we have to wear a mask? Well, so I've written about this. If I can find the article, I'll post it. What we're doing is asking the question. The book is a question. Is this a dream? Right? And the question is meant to stimulate reflections. The subtitle, if you can see it here, is Reflections on the Awakening Mind. So it's meant to stimulate reflection and meditation. Right? So when we ask, is this a dream? Just like somebody asked earlier about identity, right? We were talking about identity and the shift in identity. And I was mentioning how we are not talking about metaphysics necessarily, unless we want to call it that. We're talking about a common daily experience for every human being on the planet. Think about it, right? And when we recognize these experiences that all of us are having all the time, and when we reflect on them and their meaning, then one of the questions that comes up as we look at our dreams and daydreams and thoughts and virtual reality games and video games and scenario planning, how we plan out scenarios, what might happen, who will stand where. When we look at all of these, naturally, such questions come up, right? So we're not saying this is a dream, therefore nothing matters. Quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. This confusion is there a lot in Vedanta because the word Maya is often translated as illusion. People say everything is an illusion. But what does it mean? What does the word illusion mean? Right? If everything is an illusion, then we have just said an illusion is real because we've made everything that. Right? So the proper understanding has to be there, which is that these are modifications of an underlying aspect of experience, of a deeper aspect of experience. And when the deeper aspect is recognized, everything that we have seen, everything that we have experienced is recontextualized. It's seen in a new light. It's seen in a new context. And the recontextualization can be different enough that to a mind that is seeing a particular level, it might be described as illusion, you see, or it might be described as a dream. But the real heart of the matter is a recontextualization, a revisioning, a recognizing of this experience, what we call world and self. Right? So is this a dream is not an excuse to change the two words around and saying this is a dream and disengage. That's not what we're referring to here. But through the practice of introspection and through reflecting on is this a dream, the same question comes up in virtual reality, right? Many people talk about the world being a simulation or the Matrix movie. It brings up these questions, but it's up to us to responsibly interpret what might be happening, right? So in the ER, people are suffering. So that can't be glossed over by invoking philosophy, right? It's a revisioning, recontextualization of that which is happening and expressing at a particular range of identity that can bring out solutions. This really is the vision. Alicia says, integration of all of thyself. Yes. Okay, so we'll get to some of the other questions next time. Check out Second Mind Medicine, especially if you're interested in healthcare. And there's an article on the biopsychosocial for those that have asked about the mechanisms of healing or the approach to healing. You can check that out, and then we'll address further questions next time. All right, so we'll see you for episode 13 next Tuesday. Thank you.